What's going on, U.S. History kids? Mr. Tomei here. Today's video lecture talking about 9/11, the war on terror, some of the stuff that really occupied the news and really American culture for the early part of the 2000s. We'll go ahead and talk about this and talk about this in a lot of detail in class as well. So 9/11, I would imagine most of you have probably heard of this before, have a basic understanding of what happened on 9/11. But here is, we're going to talk about a lot about this, but just in case you don't know, here's what happened. So 9/11 happened on September 11th, 2001. And this was a coordinated foreign terrorist attack against America. Four planes were hijacked by members of a radical Islamic based group out of Afghanistan known as Al Qaeda. And these four planes were then deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers, those big buildings that you see kind of on fire there in the top picture. The Pentagon, which is where the Department of Defense, so think of the headquarters for our military, which is just outside of DC. And the fourth plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Who knows where it was headed? It's presumed that it was going to be the White House. It crashed in a field because the crew members fought back, and there's some uncertainty of what happened. But in the ensuing struggle to gain back the cockpit, most likely the plane was either brought down on purpose or just in the chaos was brought down and landed in a field in Pennsylvania. 9/11 is going to change our world and our country forever, as your homework assignment is going to teach you. But it's a pretty traumatic day. I remember I was 8 years old, and this all happened in the early morning on the Eastern time. So I used to get up pretty early to go to it's funny, it's one of those days I never forget, even though I was only 8. But I remember getting up, and I remember we'd get up early to go when my parents would drop me off for work, and then they dropped me off at my grandparents' house. So I was up pretty early. And I remember looking at the TV. My parents usually watch the news in the morning, and I saw the picture of the buildings burning. But of course, at 8 years old, I had really no understanding of what was going on. I just thought it was a really bad fire. And even after the fact, I didn't really understand until I got a little bit older of what happened. But you can see here in the images, these are planes that crashed in to the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were the largest buildings in the United States, very noticeable along the New York City skyline. If you ever watch a movie before 2001 that ever shows the New York City skyline, these will stand out. They're super tall. These buildings were mostly just really like office buildings. The centers, like people would rent out those floors, all the hundreds of floors on that building, and rent it out as office space. So a lot of business got done at the Twin Towers. This is the picture of the New York City skyline in the aftermath as the buildings collapsed. This is all the smoke and debris, which we would later find out was very toxic. So most of this part of Manhattan, lower Manhattan, was engulfed in this toxic air. And so there's a lot of long-lasting like health side effects from the people who breathe this in, especially the first responders, the firefighters, the policemen, the paramedics who had to go in and rescue people and were on the scene when all this was happening. In class, I'll show you some videos, but as the buildings collapsed, people ran, the smoke traveled pretty fast. The debris traveled very fast. You can tell people covered in ash. Again, this is all in New York City and lower Manhattan. And this was pretty much what it was left of the Twin Towers. As you can tell, just fragmented pieces of metal and just things completely destroyed. This is a picture of the Pentagon. The plane landed, looks like it blew out a whole corridor, and the debris actually even affected the further back parts of the Pentagon. And this is the remnants of the plane that crashed As you can tell, no survivors there in the field in Pennsylvania. This is a flight map chart of the planes that left. Um, so United 93 flew outside of Newark. That was actually bound for the Bay Area. Fun fact, that's the Bay Area connection to this. There were a lot of people who had Bay Area roots who actually passed away when this plane crashed in the field in Pennsylvania. The other planes you see, they took off from Boston, right? The two from Boston went to New York. And then you had the one that took off from Washington, D.C., turn around and hit the Pentagon. Again, we don't know where 93 might have headed, but if based on the flight path, most likely was probably headed towards DC to hit some monument, maybe the White House is our best guess. This is just a timeline, and I'm not going to go with bit by bit with you, but from the start, when the first plane took off from Boston about 8 a.m., it was basically over from when the final tower collapsed about 2.5 hours later. So this all happened very fast, 2.5 hours, short period of time. The West Coast was just waking up to this, and it was a very scary time. We were not sure what was going on, whether or not our country was under attack, if this was going to be a widespread thing. You ask anyone who's over the age of 20 or was over the age of 20 at the time. So anyone who's probably late 30s and older, this is probably generally one of the most terrifying, who's an American, generally one of the most terrifying days probably of their life or in their history. And when we think about the news, it was pretty terrifying and tragic. The motives for this are multifaceted, but it centers around Al-Qaeda, which is based in Afghanistan and was led by this guy. You might have heard of him before, Osama bin Laden. Ultimately, Osama bin Laden thought that the United States was an oppressive nation that hated Muslim people and hated Islam, which in some ways is partially true, but Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were angry at our support of Israel, our other intervention measures across the Middle East. And so he wanted, and Al-Qaeda wanted to see our destruction. And they'd been planning this attack for years. The irony of this and how the Cold War still affects us, long after it was over, was that the roots of like Al-Qaeda's like military like ability rooted in the Cold War, when the United States supplied Afghani freedom fighters at the time, the Mujahideen, and they tried to keep the Soviet Union, who had tried to invade Afghanistan to spread communism. But the rebel fighters, the freedom fighters, were able to keep the Soviet Union out. Kind of ironic, though, that would kind of bite us in the butt like 20 years later as the weapons and trainings evolved and became not against the Soviet Union, but against the United States. The aftermath of this is pretty significant. First off, a lot of people died. 3,000 deaths. There were over 25,000 injuries. A lot of those were first responders, a lot of firefighters, police officers, who, even as the building was on fire, went up the stairs of this gigantic building to try and save people. For about 2 days, planes around the entire country done. So there was no flights, no planes up in the sky for 2 days. And a lot of other public transit systems were shut down out of caution. A lot of places closed down, told people to go home, be with their families. It caused a lot of infrastructure damage. $10 billion in infrastructure and property damage, which back then is a lot of money. Still a lot of money today, but back then, that's a lot of money. It essentially grinded the economy to a screeching halt. Wall Street, which is in New York, didn't operate right. If planes aren't moving, right? If people aren't going to work, it's like we hit the brakes on our economy. Kind of like when the pandemic first hit and like we didn't know what was going on, and like they told us to go home and everything closed down. Kind of like that, but this was much more fast and the recovery was a little bit quicker as well once we understood the full scale of this attack. Um, but yeah, I mean, New York City is the economic center of our country, so attacking that, it's a good way to stop, and affect the American economy. There's long lasting effects, like I've talked about, because of the toxic air and the cleanup efforts. The people who went in, there were survivors that were found in the rubble, believe it or not, which is going to seem kind of crazy when I show you the videos in class. Um, and eventually we would rebuild, and there would be monuments. And now there's this building called World Trade Center One, which is to honor the two buildings. And I'll show you pictures of that. But our country's never going to be the same. And this is going to send us on a path that honestly has led to more bad things happen to our country than ever good. And has led to kind of where we're at politically now in a lot of ways, of the polarization, and kind of how one political party has like jumped the shark and gone to believe in like conspiracy theories. There's connections you can make, and I'll try to make that in class. The first big thing that really changes, not just, and again, 9/11, it's a US event, but it has global implications because the United States is this large, very connected country that has a lot of influence and power. So usually something that happens in the United States, this is going to affect the world. So before 9/11, it's hard to understand, but you could just kind of go up to the airport and, like, let's say you were going to drop off your mom at the airport, like you could walk her to the gate and just kind of go through some basic security, which was kind of like those low-key ghetto metal detectors, or maybe those metal wands, you used to be able to bring as many liquids as you wanted. You could bring even blades up to 4 inches. Like, it was super lax, which is almost kind of crazy to think about how hard it is to, you have to have this documentation and do this and have your boarding pass, and the idea of the TSA agent and the body screen, right? That's all different now. That's why the TSA was created. There was no TSA before 9/11. And so airport security, facial recognition technology, we're going to talk a little more about this, and really other surveillance security measures have seen a dramatic change around the world, and especially in the United States, since 9/11. And that kind of gets us here to kind of like the idea of the surveillance state. 9/11 provided the justification for the government to increase its monitoring of its citizens. It's pretty simple. If the government wants to know what you're doing, they can know it like that. If they have, the United States government has the resources to know pretty much everything about your life. Very easy, especially the amount of, you guys are on your phone, and younger people on their phone, and your accounts and things you like. It's all very easy to figure out who you are, what you're about, emails you do. There were a lot of legal laws that were passed, probably most infamously the Patriot Act, to kind of justify the spying on us as Americans. But the government went past some of the legal abilities that they should have, and they broke laws, and they went really past what most Americans would have ever thought. And we'll get into that a little bit more later in this unit when we start talking like Edward Snowden and stuff. Keep the NSA memes. This is pretty controversial, right? Should we be spied on or not? We can have that debate in class. More memes for you. The other big thing to come out of that is Islamophobia. America, it's like we kind of needed, after the Soviets went down, we needed like a new enemy. And historically, like, people who were Muslim or of Arab descent in this country never really had it easy, but especially after 9/11, it would get like horrible. In the days and weeks after 9/11, people were just attacked on the street, kind of similar to what we're seeing with like people getting attacked who are of Asian descent. Mosques were vandalized, windows broken. I mean, it was just kind of ridiculous, kind of xenophobia. What it is, this fear of like, oh, everyone's a terrorist, right? If they're Muslim, or if they look Arab, right? It's still an issue today, right? I mean, it was an issue during the Trump presidency. It's why we have tougher immigration laws. We'll talk about that as well in the homework assignment. And overwhelmingly, if you were to ask a majority of Americans, unfortunately, and you were to say, like, draw me a terrorist, or when they hear the word terrorist attack and like visualize that, they're going to think of probably someone who is Muslim or who is Arab. When the actual facts are that most terror attacks, by far, especially now in the United States, are carried out by white people, specifically white men. Um, so Islamophobia is a very real part of our society. Even, and honestly, in the Trump years, it's kind of gotten worse too, because people have felt emboldened by a president saying some crazy things too. You can actually see that represented in the graph. So obviously, 2001, 9/11, pretty bad. And you got to remember, this was in September. So that number is really high. That number really only represents like 4 months: September, October, November, December. So that was really bad. And then it kind of leveled off. But then we get kind of back to the Trump era when he begins to run for president, and that number spikes again. Pretty clear as to maybe why. I've shown you this picture before, right? And this is going to really, and we'll talk about this, but this is going to come to haunt President Bush, and really haunt his presidency, is the war on terror. This is the big thing he says, and I'll show you this, is that, I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock down these buildings down will hear all of us soon. That was him on a megaphone. It's actually a pretty dope moment. Probably one of his better moments for President Bush. And so this leads us to the war on terror, which we're still kind of technically in today. And the war on terror describes like the U.S. military interventions around the world in order to defeat terrorism. Most notable interventions that we're going to focus on are the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And the war on terror is very controversial. It's multifaceted. Again, there's a lot of layers to it that we can't really even unpack fully at the time we have. And the best connection I can say is it's similar to Vietnam in terms of being relatively unwinnable, and in some cases maybe pointless. So let's focus on the war in Afghanistan, because that's one we're still fighting technically. So immediately following 9/11, the U.S. invades Afghanistan because the government there, known as the Taliban, was supportive of Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So we wanted to go after the government to find bin Laden, but also make sure, Afghanistan wasn't going to have this government that would support terrorist groups that would be out of the United States. So initially it was really successful, but setting up a new democratic government has proven very nearly impossible in Afghanistan. A lot of that has to do with we diverted our attention for no good reason to Iraq, which we'll talk about. Bin Laden was able to evade the US for years. I won't give away what happens to him, but you probably know. We'll talk about it eventually when we get to Obama. And for, I'd say, the past decade plus, we've been slowly withdrawing troops out of Afghanistan, but we still have a few thousand troops there, I believe. Not as much as the peak days. President Biden actually just recently announced that all U.S. troops will be out of Afghanistan by, ironically, September 11th of 2021, 20 years to the day after 9/11. And the even greater irony is that the same government, the Taliban, who we were told we were going after and to eradicate, when we leave, we've already begun to broker a deal that they're going to be the government that takes over, which gets us to the main point. We didn't get Osama, and we didn't really get rid of the Taliban. So we just wasted 20 years, thousands of lives, tens of thousands of civilian lives, if not more, in the hundreds of thousands, and hundreds of billions, if not more, dollars. For what? It's a great question. The Iraq War. Again, a part of the Islamophobia, the xenophobia, the fear of the Middle East, the fear of terrorism, the war on terror, which was, on the front minds of Americans. The U.S. led people, primarily President Bush and people of his inner circle, were able to push the idea that Iraq was another nation like Afghanistan that was harboring terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. It was pretty easy to convince the Americans of this because most Americans were still pretty angry at 9/11. We'd already fought a war against Iraq, right? Um, and there was this idea that Saddam Hussein was this brutal dictator, which in many ways he was. So that made it a little bit easier for us to justify, going to war. Um, and so again, the war at first really popular. Um, but as time went on, Americans began to question why we were still there. We never found weapons of mass destruction. A lot of people started dying, a lot of innocent people, and so it's like, what are we kind of doing here again? Right. And the real clear answer is this: the true goal of the war was to use Americans' fear at the time to justify going to war, to get rid of Saddam Hussein, right? And really for business purposes to get control of their gas and oil. Because with Saddam Hussein gone, there'd be a whole new government in charge, and you'd have a United States military there helping write the rules and laws. Yeah. Um, the war was mostly about oil, but it was never presented that way at first. That's what we can say on the other side of this. We'll talk more about this in class. There's a lot that can be said about this time period. I don't want to make this video too long. The war on terror aftermath, we're still really not in the high peak days of the war on terror, but we are still dealing with this in 2021, primarily through the agitation of the Middle East. More radical anti-U.S. terrorist groups were formed during the Iraq War and the War on Terror. Most famously is probably ISIS. You've probably heard of. Um, and these increase of groups and violence has just led to decreased stability across Middle East and Middle Eastern nations. And a lot of people have tried to flee the violence, and it's led to a lot of immigration issues in Europe, especially looking to escape the violence. You see that picture of, like, you probably hear migrant people on boats in the Mediterranean Sea trying to come over and escape, and make it in Europe. I mean, it's crazy stuff. If we have time, I'll show you videos of that. Um, Over 6,000 U.S. soldiers have been killed in the war on terror. 50,000 have been injured. Many more have come home to a country that is now polarized about what we did there, what was the point, similar to Vietnam, trying to make that connection. A lot have been affected by PTSD. And it's estimated that over 800,000 people have been killed in the war on terror, primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, still dealing with it. And that's Saddam Hussein. He was eventually found guilty of crimes against humanity, ousted from his leadership position, and eventually he was sentenced to death in Hun. But yeah, complicated. We'll talk a lot more about it in class. I'll see you guys then.